He was written as a deep-dyed, snarling villain, and he bored the out of me, because there is no longevity in deep-dyed, snarling villainy. And already I started to plan what I was going to do about that. Irwin not only allowed me to do that, but one day said, "Do more." And I did. And the rest, as we say, is history.
There is something strange about watching Lost in Space today. The colors are brighter than you remember. The sets look smaller. The special effects, once futuristic, now carry the fingerprints of another age. And yet, somehow, the faces still feel familiar. Guy Williams standing at the center of the Jupiter 2 as Professor John Robinson. June Lockhart as Maureen Robinson, the calm heart of the family. Mark Goddard as Major Don West. Marta Kristen as Judy. Angela Cartwright as Penny. And Billy Mumy as Will Robinson, the boy who seemed to belong in space more than anywhere on Earth. For 3 seasons, from 1965 to 1968, audiences watched these people become a family. They faced strange planets, dangerous creatures, impossible situations, and, of course, Dr. Smith. But there was something viewers couldn't see. The characters were trapped in space. The actors weren't. Their lives were moving forward while their characters remained almost perfectly preserved in the minds of the audience. And that creates a strange kind of immortality. Because when millions of people remember you, they don't always remember the person you became. They remember the person you were. And for the cast of Lost in Space, that difference would become more important with every passing decade. The story began in the middle of the 1960s, when television was beginning to imagine a future filled with rockets, computers, alien worlds, and the possibility that humanity might one day leave Earth. Irwin Allen's Lost in Space took that dream and turned it into something much more personal. It wasn't really about space. Not entirely. It was about a family. The Robinsons were supposed to travel aboard the Jupiter 2 on a mission to establish a colony on another world. But sabotage by Dr. Zachary Smith sent the ship hopelessly off course, leaving the family and their companions stranded among the stars. And suddenly, the future had become a family survival story. That was the genius of the setup. You could have aliens. You could have monsters. You could have strange planets and futuristic machines. But at the center of everything was something audiences already understood. A mother, a father, children, a young man trying to prove himself, and one deeply irritating man who somehow survived every disaster. The cast became the emotional center of that world. Guy Williams, already famous for playing Zorro, became John Robinson. June Lockhart became Maureen Robinson. Mark Goddard played Major Don West. Marta Kristen played Judy. Angela Cartwright played Penny. And Bill Mumy played Will. Jonathan Harris became the unforgettable Dr. Smith, while Dick Tufeld provided the voice of the robot. At the time, none of them could have known what was happening. They were making a television show. Just another production. Just another job. But television has a strange way of turning ordinary working days into history. A scene filmed in a studio can eventually become someone's childhood memory. A costume worn for a few seasons can become instantly recognizable 50 years later. And an actor can spend decades building a career, only to discover that one character has followed them everywhere. That was the first hidden reality of Lost in Space. The show gave these actors something every performer wants: recognition. But recognition can have a price. The audience doesn't necessarily want to see you change. They want to remember you exactly as you were. Young, healthy, adventurous, standing beside the Jupiter 2. The strange thing is that the actors had no choice but to change. Years passed. The television industry changed. Their careers changed. Their families changed. And eventually, the world around them became almost unrecognizable from the world in which Lost in Space had first appeared. But whenever fans saw them again, they were often pulled backward in time. Back to 1965. Back to the Jupiter 2. Back to that family. And perhaps no one represented this strange relationship with the past more clearly than Guy Williams. Williams had already experienced major television fame before Lost in Space. His role as Zorro had made him a recognizable star. Then came John Robinson. The character was intelligent, confident, calm, and authoritative. He was the father figure at the center of the adventure. But the role would eventually become something more complicated. Because Lost in Space was not the grounded science fiction drama it might have seemed at first. As the series continued, the tone became increasingly playful and campy. The monsters became stranger. The stories became more exaggerated. And Dr. Smith became one of the biggest forces in the series. For some actors, this was simply part of the fun. For others, it created a tension between what they believed the show could be and what it eventually became. And that tension matters. Because behind every famous television character is an actor with ambitions that existed before the role. They had dreams beyond the set. They wanted different parts, different stories, different ways to prove what they could do. But audiences are not always interested in that journey. Sometimes they fall in love with one version of you. And once they do, they don't want to let go. That may be one of the cruelest things about television fame. You can spend your entire life moving forward, while millions of people keep you frozen in the past. And the Lost in Space cast would discover just how powerful that memory could become. The children of the show faced an especially unusual version of it. Bill Mumy wasn't pretending to be a child. He actually was one. Angela Cartwright and Marta Kristen were also young when the series began. For them, Lost in Space wasn't simply a job they did as adults. It became part of their childhood. They were growing up while millions of people were watching them grow up on television. And decades later, fans would still see those young faces. That's difficult to explain unless you've experienced it. Imagine being 70 years old and having strangers approach you because they remember you as 11. Imagine hearing your childhood character's name more often than people remember your adult achievements. Imagine knowing that somewhere in the world, a person is watching an episode you filmed decades ago and seeing you exactly as you were back then. Not older, not changed, not wiser, just young, forever. And perhaps that is why the story of Lost in Space is ultimately more emotional than it first appears. Because the series promised its characters a journey through space. But the real journey belonged to the people playing them. They would leave the Jupiter too. They would enter new careers. They would build families. They would age. Some would step away from acting. Some would return. And some would never live to see how long their work would survive. By the time the world fully understood the lasting power of Lost in Space, the people who made it were already living very different lives. And one of the most painful chapters would involve the man who had once stood at the center of the Jupiter 2. Guy Williams, the father figure, the star, the face of John Robinson. His story would take the idea of being trapped in the past to an entirely different level. Because eventually, the question would no longer be what happened to the characters after they disappeared into space. It would be this, what happened to the people who played them? And that is where the story becomes much harder to watch. The strangest thing about becoming famous for a character is that the character can survive you. Years after the cameras stopped rolling on Lost in Space, John Robinson was still out there. Dr. Smith was still scheming. Will Robinson was still a boy. The robot was still warning everyone about danger. But the people who played them were no longer living in 1965. They were getting older, and their careers were changing. For Guy Williams, that change was especially difficult. Before Lost in Space, he had already experienced the kind of success most actors spend their entire lives chasing. His work as Zorro had made him a television star. But Lost in Space came with a different challenge. The show became increasingly associated with its colorful fantasy elements, while Williams had been cast as its serious center. John Robinson was supposed to be the intellectual leader of the mission, the scientist, the father, the man who could be trusted when everything else went wrong. But television rarely stays exactly what it was designed to be. Shows evolve. Characters become more popular than expected. Stories shift toward whatever keeps audiences watching. And Lost in Space gradually became more comedic and fantastical. For Williams, this could create a difficult position. He was still the leading man, but the world around him was becoming more interested in the strange creatures, gadgets, and eccentric adventures than in the serious family drama that had originally surrounded the Robinsons. That tension would follow him beyond the series, because after a major television role, the next question is always the same. What's next? For some actors, the answer comes quickly. For others, it doesn't. And when the role that made you famous is still the role people most want to talk about, moving forward can become harder. But the story wasn't only about Guy Williams. The younger members of the cast were growing up too. Bill Mumy had entered the series as Will Robinson, one of television's most recognizable science fiction children. But unlike Will, Mumy couldn't remain a child. The years that passed on screen were nothing compared with the years passing in real life. He had to grow up while the world continued to remember him as the boy from the Jupiter 2. That is a strange burden for any performer. Child actors don't simply leave childhood behind. Sometimes the audience refuses to let them. For Angela Cartwright, Marta Kristen, and the others, Lost in Space became part of an identity that followed them long after the show ended. And there is a quiet irony in that. When you're young, being recognized feels exciting. It means people remember you. It means the work mattered. But as the decades pass, recognition can become a reminder of time itself. Someone approaches you and says they loved you when they were a child. And suddenly, without saying it directly, they are telling you that both of you have grown old. You are looking at a stranger who remembers the same world you remember. Only they remember it differently. They remember sitting in front of a television. You remember standing under studio lights. They remember an adventure. You remember the work. They remember the character. You remember the person you were before you became that character. This is where nostalgia becomes complicated. Because nostalgia is beautiful precisely because it edits reality. Takes the messy parts away. It removes the long workdays, the career disappointments, the uncertainty, the arguments, the years between jobs, the moments when an actor wondered whether the best part of their career was already behind them. It leaves only the image. And the image of Lost in Space was almost impossibly powerful. Family, a spaceship, a robot, a strange future, a world where every problem could eventually be solved before the closing credits. Real life was different. There were no closing credits. There was no guarantee that the next episode would be better. And there was no script telling these actors what would happen next. That became particularly important for the people who had spent years working in television. The entertainment business is built around change. A show can be successful one year and forgotten the next. A star can be everywhere and then suddenly disappear from the public eye. The audience moves on. New actors arrive. New shows become popular. New technologies change the way stories are told. And yet Lost in Space refused to disappear. Continued to live through reruns. Later generations discovered it. Fans introduced the series to their children. Science fiction audiences kept returning to it. And eventually, the original cast became living links to a television era that no longer existed. That gave them something unusual. They weren't simply actors from an old show. They became part of television history. And that meant fans wanted to know what happened to them. Reunions became important. Conventions became important. Interviews became important. People wanted to hear their memories. They wanted stories from the set. They wanted to know what the actors were really like. They wanted to see whether the people behind the characters still felt like the people they remembered. Sometimes the answer was yes. Sometimes it was more complicated. Because the passage of time changes everyone. And eventually the cast began losing members. This is where the nostalgia becomes something heavier. The original series had once been about a family trying to survive far from home. Decades later, the real-life cast was experiencing a different kind of separation. One by one, familiar faces disappeared. The actors who had once seemed permanent were proving to be anything but. And Guy Williams became one of the most haunting examples. After Lost in Space, Williams continued to work, but his life eventually took him far from the television sets that had made him famous. He spent time in Argentina, where he had family connections and where he became a familiar figure. Then, in 1989, something happened that transformed the way fans would remember him forever. Guy Williams disappeared from public view. He was found dead in Buenos Aires at the age of 65. The exact circumstances surrounding his final days became part of the mystery surrounding his death. And suddenly, the man who had once played the strong, confident father of the Robinson family was gone. No fictional planet. No futuristic rescue. No final episode. Just real life. And that distinction